Hello, welcome. All right, friends, if you're comfortable, please let's turn on our videos so I can see people, and that'll be helpful for me, if you don't mind.
As the host to stop the video.
Yes, I'll put it on when we start the class for real.
He's got everybody turned off.
Yeah. So you can mute, but turn on your video if you don't mind.
It says the host has stopped the video.
Turn on your
Oh, that
video.
means, oh goodness.
I don't know what that means.
Does that mean that I can't?
Control.
It means we can't turn on our cameras as yet.
How do I, any experts out there who want to guide me?
There's
You
Are you operating the meeting?
Yes, yes.
And you say, start video. You should be on the side, something that says with all our names to click on it. And it has lines through all the video. If you click on it, it should let us in.
Hey.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
So you
Wonderful.
have to click
Hi,
on each
Rabbi.
one.
Some of me,
Only Eliana. All right, hello. Oh, there we are. Okay, good. All right. I think you can start.
Rabbi, did you get my voicemail?
Yes, yes. I'll get back to you later today or tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay.
There we go.
You're
So you
welcome.
can start video. I think that'll should work for everybody.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, all.
Wow.
We're good.
Hey,
Morning.
there we are. Good morning. It's afternoon for us.
Afternoon, hello.
We're in a time warp. All right. Welcome. We'll still wait 1 more minute for everybody, and then
Need
we'll
a lamp for me.
get going.
Need a lamp for me.
Mhm.
Can't see any.
Rabbi, this is
Yes.
Connie.
Hi, Connie.
I don't see anywhere to turn my video on,
I think it'll be.
but it doesn't matter. But
yeah, I'd like to see it if I could. Let's see
well,
if I-
thank you.
It's nice to teach to people. Yeah.
Yes, it's nice to see them on the other side.
Okay, go get your.
Connie, scroll your
Yes,
cursor to the bottom left corner of your screen, and there's a little
No, I can't do that.
thing that says start or stop
Go
video.
Find your phone. I'm busy.
there's a cross through the video thing,
Yeah.
the Zoom emblem. I'm going to click on that.
Perfect.
Start video. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Technology is overwhelming.
Very good.
There she is.
There you are. Beautiful.
Okay.
All right. Are we ready? So there's a bracha that we can say together, which is la'asok b'divrei Torah, which means to engage in Torah study. So let's say that together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Right, and so that means to be engaged in Torah study. Right, we could use the word lil mode, which is the typical word for studying, but la'asok means really to engage in Torah study. And so that's what I hope for today, that we'll really be engaging both intellectually and spiritually. And so let us begin. So last week we talked about, let me share my screen. Okay. Yeah, technology. There we go. Okay. How's that going?
Okay.
Yeah, is it working?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Class 2, the world of the Bible. So last session, we talked about Torah and the 5 books of Moses. And today we'll talk about the entire canon of the books of the Torah. So we have the 5 books of Moses, and then we have T stands for Torah. So this is the word Tanakh. So Tanakh is what the name of the book is. The name of the entire canon of the Jewish people is called Tanakh. And so it's an acronym. It stands for Torah, that's over here. Nevi'im are the prophets, and Ketuvim are the writings, right? And so it's also known in Christian circles as the Old Testament. Why don't we call it the Old Testament? Well, we don't believe there's a New Testament, right? So we just call it the Bible. And that's as differentiated from Torah. So Torah is the 5 books of Moses. That's what we have in our Torah scrolls in the Ark. And then the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the prophets and the writings, are generally found in kind of a book like this. Yeah, so all right, JPS, Hebrew, English, Tanakh, right? And so it has in it all 3 sections of the Hebrew canon, which is the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. We studied about Torah last time, and it's the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's the sort of the DNA, the spiritual DNA of who we are as a people. Right? It started in prehistoric times, right? Which is, you know, the world of the imagination of how we got here. And then it talks about the wilderness, the traveling through the wilderness. And the question that scholars have is, did it happen or didn't it happen, right? So there doesn't seem to be any evidence in the Sinai desert of hundreds of thousands of people wandering through the desert. You would think you would see a couple of, you know, historical, archaeological evidence. The same is true for the splitting of the sea. Did that happen or did it not happen, right? Usually, my take on it is that the Torah is based on actual events, like there was a flood at some point. We know that from other civilizations and cultures who also have flood stories, right? And so we can imagine that there was flooding that happened in the ancient world, and then the story gets built around the flood. The story of Noah gets built around the actual flood, even though it may not have covered all the earth, right? It certainly covered a lot of the earth, and it seemed like it covered all the earth, right? So that's Torah, and you know, its historicity is questionable. But then when we get into Nevi'im, we have right, the prophets and the writings and Joshua, right? So as if you recall, the Torah ends with Moses almost getting into the promised land, right? And but he doesn't get in, right? He's up in Har Nevo and looks over the land of Israel, and tragically, right, he doesn't get to go into the land of Israel. Now, the reason given in the Torah is that he hit the rock, right? And right, so the Israelites were complaining, as they did a lot in the desert. And Moses, at one point, got so fed up with them, right? God told Moses to speak to the rock, and water would flow forth, right? They were thirsty at the time. And God said, speak to the rock, and water will flow forth from the rock. And Moses, when it came time to speak to the rock, he got so upset and he lost his temper. And instead of speaking to the rock, he hit the rock. And he said, oh, you rebels. And he started yelling at the Israelites, and he lost his temper, right? And so, you know, the punishment was from God that because you hit the rock, you're not allowed into the land of Israel. The question is asked, that really doesn't seem fair. Moses put in a lot of work, but the rabbis, you know, scholars and rabbis answer that it wasn't only the act of hitting the rock, it was that the fact that he lost his temper, right? And he was aging, right? And he was getting a little bit grumpier, right, in his old age, right? And he wasn't the person to lead the Israelites into battle, right? So in Hebrew school, growing up, we imagine that Moses was promised the land of Israel, and the Israelites were promised a land flowing with milk and honey, right? It was just a perfect land. And in my imagination, I don't know about yours, it was an empty land, right? And so just waiting for us to move in. However, that's not the way it was. And this is where the prophets, this is where the Nevi'im kick in. And in the prophets, we can actually dig up some archaeological evidence, right? So for example, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, right? And that's the first book of the prophets. Moses almost gets in, and then his student Joshua, his intern Joshua, that he'd been grooming, takes over for Moses. and he's a young man, and he's got a lot of verve and chutzpah and energy. And he's the one that takes the Israelites into the land of Israel because they had to fight. They had to battle, right? There are people living there, and it's called the Conquest of the land of Israel. Of course, that raises all kinds of moral issues for us. We won't get into that today. But so that's why Joshua had to take over from Moses. And so Joshua is the first book of the prophets, right? And so here's kind of a list of, is this backwards? Well, you can't really see it. But wait, so there's 30, I think it's 39 books in the entire Hebrew Bible. And one can imagine that each of these books were sort of separate scrolls. Right? Archaeologically speaking, the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran were discovered, and it was a cave in which, it was a library in which all these scrolls were contained, right? And so we can imagine that there were other ancient libraries in which all these scrolls were written down from generation to generation, telling the story from generation to generation, right? And ultimately collected into one Tanakh, into one Hebrew Bible. And so what a miracle it is that these scrolls survived through the ages, through antiquity, so that we could write them down in a book and publish them with a printing press. It's simply miraculous, right? And we're going to review some of the books a little bit more as we move along, right? So we learned about the Nevi'im. These are the prophets. Next come the Ketuvim. These are the writings, sort of miscellaneous writings, miscellaneous scrolls that got collected over the years, including things like the wisdom literature, right? The story of Job and the poetry of the Psalms, right? One example of what's in here is the Psalms were the songbook of the Levites in the temple, right? We will learn about that a little bit in our timeline, but we had two holy temples, and the Levites were the choir. The Levites used to sing these songs as the Israelites gathered, as the Israelites sacrificed their sacrificial animals and their sacrificial flour and cakes, right, that were on the altar. And so it was set to music, right, because everything's better with music background. And the Psalms are the remnants that we have of the song book of the Levites. And sometimes they start off, this is for the Levites on this special instrument, and then it heads into the psalm. And so it's very clear that these psalms were used as the song book of the Holy Temple. So that's one example of the miscellaneous things that are in the writings. And we'll look at a little bit more in depth as we move along. Right, and here we go. Here we go. Biblical literary genres found in the Tanakh, right? So the four types of books that we have was history, and now we're actually heading into archaeological history, right? So there are archaeological digs, right, in Jericho and in places where the Tanakh says that the Israelites were and conquered these different cities. And so we actually have archaeological evidence from around the time of Joshua, but it goes through Joshua, Judges, Samuel is one of the prophets and judges, and then we finally appoint kings, God appoints kings, and Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles. So these are historical books. They tell the story of the Jewish people in the land of Israel and beyond. There's also wisdom literature like Ecclesiastes, in which we find there is a season, turn, right? The season for everything, a time to be born, a time to die. These are collections in the wisdom literature. Then we have the prophets that we'll learn about in depth. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Micah, and Jonah. Right? We know the story of Jonah. We read on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, the story of Jonah and the whale. Right? And so Jonah is one of our prophets, right, who prophesizes for the people of Nineveh to repent, right? And that's his job, is right to go to Nineveh and tell the people to repent. And a little foreshadowing of what we're going to learn today. He didn't want to go, right? So how do you tell a false prophet from a true prophet? Well, one is, if the prophecy comes true or not, right? We can look back on the prophecies and see if they came true. But another way is, right, that most of the time, false prophets are there for the ego. False prophets, want to get up and prophesize to the people. A true prophet does it against his own will, right? The prophet, he doesn't want to be a prophet. It's hard to be a prophet. No one likes a prophet, right? And so, because he's yelling at you all the time. And so that gets very clear with Jonah. And God says, Jonah, go to Nineveh and tell them to repent. And he says, what, are you kidding me? Like, first of all, it's not going to work. Second of all, I don't want to go, right? And so he ends up on a ship and in the whale, and God brings him to Nineveh anyway, right? So that's kind of a classic story about a true prophet. Right? A true prophet prophesizes against his own desires and against his own wishes. Right? So that's prophecy. We'll learn about that more in a moment. And finally, we have poetry. Right? We have psalms. We have the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. And I mentioned the Psalms, which is the songbook of the Levites in the Holy Temple, and Lamentations, right? It's I'm talking like this because, right, they're sad, right? And it's stories of destruction of the Jewish people, and many of these books get read in synagogue, right? So Lamentations is on Tisha B'Av. And it has special melody to it. So you can hear how it's a sad, tragic melody. And many of these books are read liturgically in the synagogue on special holidays, right? And one more thing to note, right? The 5 books of Moses are read during the service, and they're called the Torah reading. And then there's something called the Haftarah reading, right, which follows the Torah reading. The Torah reading comes from the 5 books of Moses, and we go through it, all year round in order. However, the Nevi'im, the prophets, right, are called the Haftarah reading, and so we choose a selection from the books of the prophets to accompany the Torah reading. And how do we select which prophetic readings we're going to choose? But ones that connect us with the Torah reading. They share the same theme, right? And so we read the Torah every Shabbat and read the Haftarah selections from the prophets, right, that we can see up on our screen. The Ketuvim, right, we already talked about. And then again, it's Tanakh. This is the ch part of Tanakh, which is the Ketuvim, right? And that is miscellaneous, right? Chronicles, which gives our history, wisdom literature like Job, and poetry like the Psalms, right? And there's the 4 types of biblical literature that we have. All right, let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. It's kind of hard to see, right?
Oh.
Can you make that out? So I'll read it for you, which will make it a little bit easier. So this is our biblical timeline. And what we're going to do is sort of go through our timeline of the Israelites during the time of the Nevi'im. And so we start out with the conquest of Kanaan. Well, first we go patriarchs and matriarchs. So that's, 2000 BCE. How many years ago is that? many millennia that goes back. And then 1200 BCE, right? This is the Exodus from Egypt, 1250. And this is where we really begin, right? And so take note that this says primordial history, right? Creation, Noah, Babel, that's sort of before, right? It tells the stories of how we got here, our myths, right? That are our stories. Think about myth, right? Nowadays we use myth as kind of fabrication or lie, right? 10 myths about this or that we see in magazines. But as you know, like capital M, myth, is the story, or like, right, mythology, right? Greek mythology is the story of how we got here. And so these are our myths, right? Adam and Eve in the garden, and Noah and the Tower of Babel. That's primordial history. That's not even on the timeline, right? But our timeline sort of starts with the patriarchs and matriarchs, where we can kind of date the time that they would have existed, time that they would have lived. Right, here's the Exodus from Egypt, 1250, right? 1200 BCE, we start with the conquest of Kanaan by Joshua, and that's where the Nevi'im start. 1200 BCE, right, is where the conquest of Canaan starts. Moses dies and Joshua takes over. And this begins the period of the judges, right? So we've heard of Samson and Delilah, right? He was one of the judges. Deborah was one of the female judges. Isn't that beautiful? Right. And so that's around 1200 BCE. We move forward in time. 1100 BCE is still the time of the judges. Right. And finally, right before now, we were a sort of loose band of tribes. Right. So we use the word tribes, 12 tribes, but we don't often think about what that means to be a tribal society. Right. So I guess the reference that we have to tribal living is the Native American tribes. Right. They're all sort of Native Americans, but they were very different. Each of them had their own language. Each of them had their distinct character. Right. And although we shared the same language, the character of each tribe was very different from one another. Right. And so finally, after a while, they said, you know what? They looked around at other nations, and other nations had kings. And the people complained and said, we want a king, right? We don't want to be a loose federation of tribes, right? Because we want to be strong and we have to go into battle. And so we need a king. And God says, believe me, you don't want a king, right? Because the king is going to take advantage of the people. The king is going to get royalty, is going to get messed up, and they're going to tax you and take away your sons and daughters and money and cattle. You don't want a king. And the people said, no, we do want a king. And so God said, okay. And the first king of Israel was King Saul, right? King Shaul. Saul was the first king of Israel. And his son's name was Jonathan. And the problem was, well, first of all, Saul was they described Saul as a tall, handsome man, right? His head and shoulders above the rest. And so he was chosen as the first king. His son's name was Jonathan, who I suppose would have been heir to the king. However, Jonathan's best friend was David, right? So they loved each other very much. And David had sort of a special quality about him. Well, first of all, he was a warrior. We know the story of David and Goliath, right? He was an amazing warrior and fighter, but he was also a lover and a poet. And we know about the lover from Bathsheba, right? The story of David and Bathsheba. And so he was a very well-rounded man. He was, on one hand, this fierce warrior. On the other hand, a lover and a poet, and played instruments. I think he played the lyre, right? And ancient guitars. And so he was a singer, songwriter, and a poet, and also a fierce warrior. And so instead of the dynasty going to Shaul's son, Jonathan, Jonathan passed on the royalty and David became the king. And it was pretty tough. Shaul didn't want David to be king. He wanted to retain his own royalty. But even during his reign, David started to get more and more popular as a warrior. And the women would sing about David's heroic efforts during battle. And ultimately, David became the king. Right? And David's son was King Solomon. So David was a warrior who defeated all the enemies, right? And consolidated the royalty in the city of David, right? Which we can still go to. It's near the Western Wall, and you go down a little bit down the hill, and you can find the city of David, where David's palace was. So we can archaeologically connect to King David. And so he was a fighter, a military guy who was extremely successful and confederated all the tribes right around him. And so instead of being a loose federation, they became a kingdom, the Israelite kingdom. His son inherited this peaceful situation, and King Solomon was able to flourish because he didn't need to fight, right? And so King Solomon further united and solidified the monarchy. One of his strategies was to marry princesses from all over the world. And so he had a extensive harem and taxed the people in order to build the first temple. And so King Solomon builds the first temple in 950 over here, right? The construction of the first temple. And the monarchy continues through David and Solomon and goes on from there for quite some time. The first temple introduced a centralized worship. There used to be small temples all over the land of Israel and beyond. And each tribe and each city had their own temple. But when King Solomon built his temple, he abolished all other altars and temples, and there became one temple in Jerusalem, and everybody had to go on pilgrimage to get to the temple in order to offer their sacrifices. And so they came from all over, right, and left their homes and families and came to the Holy Temple, and it was a giant festival, and people offered their sacrifices there. Right, they offered their own sacrifices like sheep and cattle, but as you can imagine, it was pretty tough to schlep all their stuff that they wanted to offer in the temple. And so sometimes they just brought money if they couldn't take all their stuff, and they paid for sheep that were held in a pen in order to sell to the pilgrims to offer in the sacrifice. And archaeologically, we found those pens that the cattle were stored, and we even found the coins with little sheep on them that they would exchange for money. They paid money and they got a token, and we have those tokens. And the token was used to purchase the sheep, the receipt to show that you, and we have it. And so we're now in even more archaeologically sound historicity. As we continue on our timeline, right, we have the 12 tribes, and there became a tribal civil war, and the 10 tribes of the north, right, became their own entity, and the 2 tribes in the south became the tribe of Judah. So Judah was on the bottom in the south, and the top were all the other 10 tribes. The Assyrians came in and wiped out all 10 tribes, right? And they became known as the lost tribes, right? And so there are folks today that claim that they're part of these lost tribes, which is an amazing thing, but they became assimilated throughout the Assyrian Empire. And the 2 tribes that bonded together to create the tribe of Judah were the survivors, right? So those are our ancestors from the tribe of Judah. And that's why, right, we got the name. We changed it from Israelites and the sons of Jacob to Judaism, right, to Jews, right? So we come from the tribe of Judah. And so we got the name Judaism because the northern tribes got assimilated and spread out throughout the diaspora. And the tribe of Judah, right, became the Jewish people. And Judaism is named after that, right? And so let's skip forward a little bit, in 586 BCE, the Babylonians came in and wiped out the first temple, and we got exiled into Babylonia, right? And that's where by the waters of Babylon, right? And we were in Babylonia, not for very long, a couple of decades, but it was a serious cataclysmic event, right? And that was our first, exile, right? And in the diaspora, we'll talk about that in a moment. King Cyrus of Persia comes in, and he allows the Israelites, I guess, who are the Jews at this point, to go back to their homeland. And he opens the gates and says, okay, you can go back now. Not everyone went back, right? Only the most hardy, the hale and hardy went back because it was a long trip. And Babylonia and, under King Cyrus was a pretty welcoming place, right? And so we know about that, right? And so that sets up the diaspora. We have people who are living in Israel, and we have people who are living in Babylonia, right? And so it kind of mirrors what we have now, right? There are people there are Jews all over the globe, but the main populations lived in Israel and in Babylonia, right? And so that's sort of a template for what we have today, right? There's Jews all over the world. However, right, a large percentage of the Jews live in two places, live in Israel and in the diaspora in America, right? And the Jews are pretty, I guess very well off here in Israel. Here in America. The freedom of religion puts us in a pretty safe space. However, well, we'll take a little more deeply in a few moments. So when they get back to the land of Israel, they rebuild the second temple, and it exists like that, a small sort of temple for a long time. That's 515, right? And then we build the second temple, and when Herod comes in, the Romans come in, and for the first time, right? So why is Alexander the Great known as the Great? Because he figured out a tribute system, right? Instead of when you expand your empire, all of the empires before Alexander the Great demolished, right? They demolished and took slaves and pillaged and sent people away, and they ruined, right, the cities, and then rebuilt them for the Assyrians, right, for themselves, for the Babylonians, for themselves. Alexander the Great said, well, he came up with a different idea. How about we expand our empire, not by demolishing cities and lands, but keeping them, relatively free. However, they have to pay tribute, right, to the king, right? And so we were part of that effort. And so Jerusalem, right, was for the Jews, but also the Romans started coming in, and they affected our culture. The Hellenists is what they were called, and they built some beautiful temples, and they built some amphitheaters, right? And the Israelites saying, well, this isn't so bad, right? And so that's when we started this debate, whether we should assimilate a little bit more, right, or keep ourselves more isolated And so there we go. And then the end of the Tanakh period here is 450 BCE, still a long time ago. And under Ezra, that's what we believe and what scholars believe was really where the Torah and the Tanakh ultimately got codified, right? So as I mentioned before, it was likely came from different scrolls that got passed down from generation to generation. There were scribes who worked in the temple. In the temple, there was a special room that held holy scrolls. But eventually, we sort of had to weave it all together, right? And make the Torah and the Tanakh. And so that's where we do it under the leadership of a Jewish leader named Ezra. And so let's go through it a little bit more in detail, right? We started off with the early Israelite period, Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. And here we see some archaeological evidence of the conquest of Canaan and Joshua's army. Again, we were a tribal society under Joshua, and the role of the judge was the leader, right? And so Moses would judge cases and keep civil order, and that job got passed down to the judges of the future. There's King David, right? So it starts off with King Saul, and then David gets put in his stead, and then King Solomon comes after King David, right? Solomon was David's son. Here's sort of an overview, a bird's eye view of the temple. I think part of the important parts is, right, they entered here and there through the southern gates and the eastern wall. And here's the women's court. Unfortunately, in ancient civilizations, the women were second-class citizens. My apologies. Now we're egalitarian in the conservative movement, so happy about that. But back in the day, this is where the women were, right? And then this is Nicanor's gate, the court of the Israelites. Here's the altar on which the sacrifices were offered. There's a laver here. The laver was for ritual washing and water. And then this is where the priests were let in. And then ultimately the high priest, only once a year on Yom Kippur, could enter the Holy of Holies. Nobody could enter the Holy of Holies except the high priest on Yom Kippur. And that was scary too. When the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, they put a rope around his waist and bells on his cloak. So much like a sheep, right? And they're, help me out. What's that? The instrument that goes around the sheep's neck? A cowbell, like the cow, right? The cowbell, right, lets you know where the cow is and if the cow's doing okay and walking around. Same thing with the high priest. They had bells on the bottom of his gown so that they could make sure that he was still alive, because the Holy of Holies was like fire, right? A holy fire. And it was a dangerous place because the holiness was so intense. You had to be pure of heart, pure of hands, right? Your actions and behavior had to be pure, and your intentions had to be pure. And so there was a risk for the high priest to go into the Holy of Holies. And so again, they tied a rope around his waist in case he died. They weren't allowed to enter the Holy of Holies to get him. And so they would drag his corpse right out with the rope. And so pretty crazy stuff. But this is our temple. This is the first temple. Let's move on in history. Right, we have our divided kingdom, north and south. The north gets wiped out by Assyria, resulting in the 10 lost tribes. Elijah the prophet shows up during this time. Elijah the prophet, his spirit is still around, we imagine, right? So he's still around at times of transition, liminal, sort of dangerous times. We have the protection of Elijah the prophet. 3 examples. A Brit Milah, right? Every time a Jewish baby is circumcised, we have a chair of Elijah, right? That comes, and we imagine that it offers the baby some protection, right, from the circumcision. On Saturday nights during Havdalah, when we go from a state of holiness back to the mundane, and it's tricky to do that sometimes, we sing Eliyahu Hanavi, right? Elijah the prophet is there. And finally, at the Passover Seder, right, at a time when we're sort of exposed to the world, we open the door and Elijah the prophet, the spirit of Elijah the prophet comes in, drinks a little bit of wine, and then moves on to the next house, right? So that's Elijah the prophet and so why is, of all prophets, why is Elijah the prophet the one who we still turn to for protection? It's because he never died. The story is he was taken away by a chariot of fire, right? And so he's the prophet that got swooped up into the heavens. And so we imagine that he's still around because he never died. We have the Babylonian exile by the rivers of Babylon. He prayed. This is also where when the temple fell, right, the temple was a musical place. It had instruments and it had the choral singing of the Levites. Ever since then, we decided, you know what?
Rabbi, ask everybody to turn off their microphones.
Yes, everybody mute for a second, please. Everybody got it? And Cyrus the Great comes in and allows the Jews, the Israelites, to get back to the land of Israel. So the Babylonian exile, as I mentioned, is the first time that we have a diaspora Judaism. So what does it mean to have a diaspora Judaism? Well, we no longer had the Holy Temple to pray. And so what happens is, instead of having a temple and offering sacrifices, we needed a Torah, right? So the Torah became the centerpiece of Judaism and replaced the temple as the centerpiece of Judaism. So we have the synagogue in which the Torah is read, and we also have the Jewish home. And it is said, the rabbis teach, that instead of having a sacrificial altar up on Mount Zion, every table, every Shabbat table, or every table in which we eat and we study a little bit of Torah, that takes the place of the altar, right? And so one of the remnants of the altar at our Shabbat tables is the salt, right? We used to salt the meat before we ate it back in the temple. The priests used to eat the sacrifices, right? Which is interesting, right? We usually see the sacrifices as cruel, right? And however, it was a barbecue, right? We put the meat on the altar, we offered it to God, and then the priests ate the meat, right? That part we don't really know about, but it was like a steak dinner, right, for the priests, and that's how they survived, and that's how they ate, right? And so when the temple fell, Judaism divided into two places. One of them is the synagogue, in which the Torah is the centerpiece, and it's the Holy of Holies, right? And so it takes place there, right? And when we open the ark, we rise, and it's the holiest place. And as a rabbi, I occasionally get in there and work with the Torahs, but most people, right, can never enter that ark. We open it, we look at it, but rarely do we walk into it, right? Because it seems like such a holy place. It takes over. It's the remnant of the Holy of Holies. And then, so the written Torah becomes a centerpiece. One beautiful aspect of the Torah is that it can be carried, right? It can be, it's all of a sudden Judaism becomes portable in the diaspora. And so that's how the written Torah became so important. Okay, so let's start off with the prophets. So that's sort of a historical timeline, an overview of the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Let's focus in on the prophets. So Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote a book called The Prophets. And let's read some selections from that book, and then we'll analyze a little bit. What manner of man is the prophet? A student of philosophy who turns from the great discourses of the great metaphysicians, right? A student of philosophy who studies Aristotle, Plato, and then reads the orations of the prophets may feel as if you were going from the realm of the sublime to an area of trivialities. Instead of dealing with timeless issues of being and becoming and what is and what should be, of definitions and demonstrations, he's thrown into orations about widows and orphans, about the corruption of judges and the affairs of the marketplace, right? The prophet goes into the muck, right? The prophet goes into the streets, right? The metaphysician, right? The philosopher is in the academy, but the prophet is in the streets. Instead of showing us a way through the elegant mansions of the mind, the prophets take us to the slums. The world is a proud place, full of beauty, but the prophets are scandalized. They make much ado about paltry things, lavishing excessive language on trifling subjects. They make, why such immoderate excitement? Why such intense indignation? Indeed, a little bit more, the sort of crimes and even the amount of delinquency that fill the prophets of Israel with dismay do not go beyond that which we regard as normal, as typical ingredients of a social dynamic. To us, a single act of injustice, cheating in business, exploiting the poor is slight. To the prophets, it was a disaster. To us, injustice is injurious to the welfare of the people, right? We don't like it. To the prophets, it's a death blow to existence, right? That's their metaphysical reality. It's a death blow to existence when people behave badly. To us, an episode, to them, a threat of the world. The prophet's words are outbursts of violent emotions, right? They can't help it. They can't stop themselves. There's a true calling, right? And it's not for their own sake. It's not for their own honor. It's because they can't do otherwise. Outbursts of violent emotions. His rebuke is harsh and relentless. But if such deep sensitivity to evil is to be called hysterical, what name should be given to the abysmal indifference to evil which the prophet bewails? Right? We could think about the prophet as, going too far, insane, right, or hysterical. But think about what happens when we're indifferent to the evil that the prophet bewails, and people don't protect the orphan and the widow, and people do cheat in business all the time. That would be hysterical. The prophet is a man who feels fiercely. God has thrust a burden upon his soul, right? He's not doing it necessarily to fix the world because he wants to. God has thrust a burden upon his soul, and he's stunned at man's fierce greed. Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony. It's a form of living, a crossing point of God and man. God is raging in the prophet's words, right? God is raging in the prophet's words, right? And so, right, Rabbinic Judaism inherits its character from two different places that we've seen today. One is from the world of the priests. The other is from the world of the prophets, right? And Rabbinic Judaism inherits both the priest and the prophet. On one hand, right, rabbis are called upon to be priests, which means to officiate at ceremonies, to be a representative of the people of Israel before God. That's what a priest is. A prophet, right, is a social activist, a moral compass. And so the Rabbinic Judaism inherits both sides, the priest and the prophet. And oftentimes contemporary rabbis lean towards one or the other, right? We all know rabbis that are social activists that like to stir up the congregation and get involved with social action. And then we know rabbis, right, who focus on the spiritual, that focus on officiating at life cycles, that focus on the health and welfare of their congregation, right? And those are the priests, right, who officiate at life cycles and find their rabbinate focusing on that. Right? So personally, right, I come from a lineage of Levites. My father was a Levi, and father before that was a Levi. And so we're Leviim. And so that means we inherit the Levitical take on things, which is really more towards the priest than the prophet. But every rabbi is on the spectrum between a priest and a prophet. So here's the prophet raging in the streets, right? And here's stuff that they rage about. In this case, we see Isaiah, who's raging about the corruption of the temple and the focus on ritual instead of the practical, right? And so, shout it aloud, do not hold back, raise your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their rebellion and to the descendants of Jacob their sins, right? And so he refers to Yom Kippur, about the fast days. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? The people are complaining that, we've done everything that we should be doing, right? And where's the reward, right? And we still are attacked by our enemies, and we still haven't seen the glory of God and, the Garden of Eden and peace on earth, right? We're doing everything we should. We're doing all of our ritual practices. So why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed, right? What good are we doing if we can't see a reward from all of our rituals like fasting? Here's why. Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high, right? It's not about the rituals, right? It's about treating each other kindly. It's about creating peace and pursuing peace in your community. Is this the fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head, right? Is that what you call a fast day that's acceptable to God? Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? This is what I want, to loose the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke, right? It's not food that I want on the temple, right? It's what I want is behavior, is to take care of people in the street, to make sure that you're feeding the poor, to make sure that you're helping the needy, to make sure that you're looking out at all the vulnerable folks that are in your community, right? And that's the prophet who rails at the people, and in this case, about injustice, about walking through rituals by rote and not really taking care of people. And so that's one example of what the prophet is yelling about. Right? And right, we can see Abraham Joshua Heschel, right? So this is one of the famous marches he went on with Martin Luther King and civil rights, right? That's what, so not only did Abraham Joshua Heschel write about the prophets, he became a modern day prophet, right? Instead of spending his time in synagogue, instead of spending his time in the academy, he was out on the streets marching with Martin Luther King. He was protesting the Vietnam War, right? And so he was a prophet who spoke of peace and who spoke of justice, right? And that's how Abraham Joshua Heschel became so infatuated with the prophets, because he too heard that calling, right? And so the vision of the prophets and the energy of the prophets is still around today, right? And so we too can pick up on that energy, right? I labeled myself a priest rabbi earlier, but to be a well-rounded person, I think we need both, right? We need to take care of our ritual needs, to take care of the people around us, right? To pray, to learn, to study, to create communities. That's the priest's job. The prophet's job is to get out of the synagogue, right? And get on the streets and do what's right, right? And help people and fight for justice in our civilization, right? With leaders, with political leaders, to engage in politics of our time. Right? And so the Tanakh, right, to summarize, right, is made up of 3 parts, right? The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which is our DNA, which we study, and right, 2 bits of show and tell before we leave, right? We learned about the Torah. It's the written law, but it also is accompanied by the oral tradition in which, right, we keep the Torah relevant and we keep the Torah good, right, and peaceful. And so here's sort of a modern day commentary on the Torah. We see the text up here at the top of the translation, and then most of the page is filled with rabbinic commentary, right? And so that's this Chumash, the Torah text that we use in our synagogue. And here's kind of a traditional way of studying. Again, we have the Torah text in the top. Then we have all these commentaries around, right? This is the Torah text. And then everything on this page and everything on this page, right, is the oral tradition, right? So that's Torah, which is the written tradition and the oral tradition. And then we have our Nevi'im, our prophets, right, who rail against injustice. And then we have our Ketuvim, which is a miscellaneous collection of wisdom and psalms and songs and poetry and lamentations, right, and our wisdom literature. Right? So today we covered Tanakh, right, which is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings. Right? And so that completes our canon of what Christians call the Old Testament, and we call the Bible, which is the Tanakh, right? And so we have, right, when you go to the bookstore, right, and this gets confusing for people who want to learn about Judaism, right? We have 2 different books. One of them is called the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses. And the other one is called the Bible, right, which includes Torah and the prophets and all the writings. All right. So questions with our final few minutes that we have?
Rabbi, I do.
Yeah.
Why did Cyrus let us go when the Pharaoh of Egypt didn't?
That's a good question, right? So some of the folks that conquered the world, some empires were cruel, but some of them were, beneficent. Some of them weren't too bad, right? And so Cyrus is an example of a king, an empire that was, beneficent, that allowed people their freedom to practice religion and to go back to their lands from which they came. And so actually a minority of people went back to the land of Israel, but the majority stayed in Babylon and became a rich and beautiful, wealthy, but actually wealthy also, but became an active and wonderful community, sort of like we have in America, right? And so in Babylon, they collected they had the time to write books, right? And so there's actually 2 Talmuds. We'll talk about the Talmud later on, but there's one that was collected in Babylonia and one that was collected in the land of Israel. And the Babylonian Talmud is the one that we study because they had the most leisure time. And in Israel, it was hard to live, right? It's a lot of work to farm the land, to irrigate the land. But in Babylonia, they had it relatively easy. And so they had the leisure time to study and to put together the Babylonian Talmud, which we still study today, even more than the Palestinian Talmud, which is the Talmud that came from the land of Israel. And so we had those two communities, just like we have now in America and in Israel.
And then I have one more question, and then when you fast, if you cannot do it completely due to like a medical condition, like you
Yes.
take medicine or whatever,
Yes.
is it still okay that you fast like one food for a certain amount of time and stuff like that during the holidays?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The rabbis were very forgiving especially for medical situations.
Yeah, and
Right?
so,
We
because I
believe.
take medicine, so
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Bill,
so-
you have a question?
Yes, I do. On the scrolls, on the Dead Sea Scrolls and such, was there any conflicts in what one scroll would say versus another? Or were
Yes.
they all consistent in what
Yeah.
they were saying?
Excellent question. No, I mean, they were inconsistent,
Right.
which is why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important and so valuable and so interesting, is because there are different variations of some of these books. And so ultimately, Ezra and the scribes had to decide which ones were the ones that we were going to use, right? And so one example is in the Ashrei, in one of our scrolls in the Psalms called the Ashrei. It's a popular prayer. There's one letter, it's an acronym. I'm not an acronym. It goes through Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, A, B, C, D, E, right? And there's one missing. The Nun is missing, right? And the rabbis come with all kinds of explanations of why it's missing, but it seems to be that it got dropped, right? And because we discovered previous scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls that had it in there, right? And so there were scribal errors that happen. And there's just variant texts that had to be culled through and ultimately canonized and decided upon. Good question. Yeah, Lauren and Glenn.
Hi, I've been writing down a couple of questions.
Please.
Could in the pre-temple era of the tribes, would that have been a bit more like rabbinical Judaism, since there wasn't a central authority?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yes. In the world of the prophets, right, the way that Moses worked it is that there were local, right, he got advice from his father-in-law, right, that he couldn't do all the judging. He was staying up all night and judging cases. And ultimately, his father-in-law, Jethro, told him, gave him the advice that you really got to set up sort of a local system. And then, right, if it becomes a difficult case, then it gets put to the higher courts and ultimately to Moses, who only took the most difficult cases. And so, the rabbis have authority these days of their own congregations. It's called the Mara De'atra, rabbi of the place. Recently we have some centralized rabbinic courts in the Reform movement and in the conservative movement. But in the Orthodox communities, it still kind of runs like that the local judge really has a lot of leeway. And so, I think there is some similarities. But we have our denominations, right? We have our Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and more. And so in a sense, we're also a tribal society, right? Because we each have our own way of doing things. And in the Reform and conservative, we each have our own rabbinic courts, national and international. But the Orthodox community still works decentralized, right? As it was in the past. One more thing about denominations is, right, we also value different points in our timelines. So for example, the Orthodox community and the conservative movement, really the pinnacle of the timeline was Moses at Sinai, the lawgiver, right? Because we are committed to the legal process of Judaism and see that as the highest value, right? Of keeping the laws and behaviorism, right? Keeping the laws of Moses and the rabbis. On the other hand, the Reform movement sees the prophetic tradition as the ultimate moment in Jewish history. And usually on the walls of Reform temples, you can see quotes from the prophets, Micah, right, and injustice and things like that, right? And so the denominations differentiate themselves by what they see as the pinnacle of the timeline of the Jewish people, Orthodox and conservative, the moment at Mount Sinai, and the Reform, the world of the prophets, right? And so also the Reform community leans towards social action and tikkun olam and away from ritual, and the Orthodox, especially the Orthodox community, but also the conservative community, leans toward ritual as the ultimate experience of connecting with God. Okay, good question.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Why were the Romans called Hellenists? I equate that word with the Greeks.
Yeah, so Hellenism, right? It was in Jewish studies refers to the Jewish people who were assimilating to Roman culture, right? And so much like in America, right, it was very attractive to assimilate to the right. And so they, once in a while you could go to a bathhouse, or you could go to the theater, or you could go to the what's it called when you have the gladiators, right?
Mhm.
And so some of the Jews started attending these things, right? And got assimilated with the Roman community. And those were called the Hellenists in Jewish studies, right? And then that caused the whole break in the Jewish community and ultimately ended up on Masada. That's a whole nother story. But
why
the
the
Zealots
term-
were railing against the Hellenists, who were the assimilators.
Why the term Hellenist? It's
I'm
so
not sure.
Greek.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, you have to ask a
Because it seems so
historian about
Greek.
that one. Yes. Oh, Greek and Roman, or Greco-Roman, I think. Right?
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. And where is Babylon today? What where is that fit geologically?
Yeah, I think it's Iraq, Iran, right in there. And right, there are still apparently some remnants of that, but not many. Yeah,
Thank you.
good questions. Thank you. All right, friends, have a good afternoon. All right, we'll send out some material. If you'd like some material and you haven't gotten any, exec.assist, right? Or just send me a note, even better. rabbi.teller@brisshalom.org, rabbi.teller@brisshalom.org, and we'll send you out the material after the class with some additional readings and things of that nature, so you can deepen your studies during the week.
Can
Thank
you
you.
supply the PDFs of the PowerPoints?
Yes, yeah, I can do that as well.
Thank you.
All right. You're gonna
Thank
send
you.
and we'll get it out to you. All right, friends. See you soon. Thanks for being here.
Bye.